The rain wasn't just cold. It was a heavy, relentless weight that poured down the concrete steps of the underground transit station, turning the subway tiles into a slick, freezing mirror. Every breath Alicia took in the damp air felt like inhaling frost. The trek down to the desolate platform was always the most exhausting part of the night, a brutal capstone to 12 hours of wringing out dirty water and pushing a battered yellow mop cart through corridors that cost more than her life. Her practical gray scrubs, rolled at the sleeves and damp at the collar, offered zero protection against the biting underground chill. They were a reminder of the ghost she was, the invisible woman who existed only from dusk till dawn. She worked at the Obsidian Tower, a monolithic fortress of black glass that loomed over the city like a titan, a place where even the shadows felt expensive. She knew the power brokers not by their faces, but by their refuse. The VP on floor 42 who constantly shattered crystal tumblers, the frantic executives in the boardroom who left behind shredded documents and spilled scotch, and him, the phantom of the penthouse. She only ever saw him in the reflection of the lobby's polished marble, a terrifying force wrapped in a flawless, bespoke suit. He moved like a predator given human form, and the world instinctively cleared his path. His suits were always midnight dark, his posture rigid with absolute, unyielding authority. His face was a mask of cold porcelain, his gaze carrying the chilling weight of a loaded gun. He never acknowledged the nighttime staff. He didn't need to. His very silence demanded submission. Alicia had once seen an arrogant rival executive drop to his knees in the grand foyer, shaking under the sheer gravity of Lee-seol's unblinking stare. He was an untouchable king, ruling a violent empire from a tower of glass. Tonight, the king was in the gutter. The subway tiles seeped a bitter cold through his soaked trousers. Lee-seol stared at his own trembling hands, his knuckles split and weeping crimson into the dirty puddles pooling around his leather shoes. Kang Dae. His cousin's name tasted like copper and ash on his tongue. Just an hour ago, Lee-seol had been standing at the apex of the Obsidian Tower, looking down at a city he owned. Then came the sudden breach, the loyalty of his inner circle bought with Kang Dae's hollow promises, the deafening crack of suppressed gunfire echoing through the pristine penthouse corridors. He had fought his way out, leaving broken men in his wake, but a king without an army was merely a target. Now he was reduced to this. He huddled near a humming, neon-lit vending machine at a deserted transit exit, his arm draped protectively over a monogrammed leather duffel bag that held the last of his untraceable assets. His tailored suit jacket was gone, and his crisp white shirt was unbuttoned and plastered to his skin by the freezing rain he had endured before fleeing underground. His lungs burned with every ragged breath. For the first time in a decade, the head of the city's most feared syndicate was prey. The walls of the city were closing in, and the biting cold was doing the rest. He squeezed his eyes shut, exhaling a plume of white mist, waiting for the inevitable sound of Kang Dae's assassins. Instead, he heard the wet squeak of rubber soles. Lee-seol flinched, his bloody hand darting instinctively toward his waistband, only to remember his weapon was gone. He snapped his head up, his sharp features pulled into a defensive snarl. It wasn't an assassin, it was a woman in damp gray scrubs, her dark hair pulled back, standing next to a battered yellow mop cart, the invisible cleaner from the tower. She stood over him, holding a heavy, worn gray coat in her outstretched hands. She wasn't trembling with fear, she wasn't backing away from the blood on his hands or the violence etched into his exhausted face. Her eyes held a quiet, radical kind of empathy. "You're going to freeze," she said, her voice steady against the rhythmic, hollow dripping of the station. She leaned down, extending the thick fabric toward him. Lee-seol stared at her, utterly paralyzed. He who commanded legions, who could end a life with a single nod, could not comprehend the gesture. In his world, weakness was an invitation for a knife. Blood in the water meant a feeding frenzy. Yet here, in the damp, fluorescent-lit purgatory of the underground, a woman who owned nothing was offering him the only warmth left in the city. He looked from the heavy wool coat to her unwavering gaze, the cold foundation of his brutal reality quietly beginning to fracture. The walk to her apartment was a blur of shadow and paranoia. Every flickering streetlight felt like a searchlight. Every distant siren was a herald of Lee-seol's certain death. Alicia kept her head down, her hand firm on the handle of her equipment cart, while the man who once commanded the city's skyline limped beside her, draped in her oversized, scratchy wool coat. He was a ghost in the rain, his lethal grace replaced by a heavy, wounded stumble. Her home was a narrow basement unit tucked beneath a crumbling brownstone, 3 blocks away from the glimmering lie of the Obsidian Tower. As she unlocked the heavy iron gate and led him down the concrete stairs, the air changed, leaving behind the sharp scent of ozone and wet pavement for the familiar, humbler notes of lemon-scented bleach and old radiator steam. "In here," she whispered, ushering him into a space that could have fit inside his former walk-in closet. The flat was a cramped sanctuary of mismatched furniture and low ceilings. Exposed pipes hummed with the building's heartbeat, and the only light came from a single amber lamp on a chipped wooden table. Lee-seol stood in the center of the room, looking like a displaced god. His presence was too large for the 4 walls. His expensive, blood-spattered fabric of his dress shirt clashed violently with her floral-patterned rug. He scanned the room with the clinical precision of a predator, his eyes landing on the small barred window that offered nothing but the view of feet of passers-by on the sidewalk above. "It's not the tower," Alicia said, her voice soft as she dropped her keys onto the counter. "But no one looks for kings in the dirt." She moved with a quiet efficiency, fetching a threadbare but clean towel and a bowl of warm water. Lee-seol didn't sit. He remained standing, his body vibrating with a tension that threatened to snap. He looked at her, really looked at her as she set the water down. In the dim amber light, the sharp angles of his face seemed to soften, though the cold fire in his eyes remained. He was the city's most wanted man, a fugitive whose head was worth a fortune, yet he was hiding in the one place his enemies would never think to look, the home of a woman they had spent years pretending didn't exist. "Why?" His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, the first words he had spoken since the gutter. Alicia didn't look up from the bandage she was unrolling. "Because tonight you're just a man who's cold, and I know what it's like to be forgotten." He finally sank into her small armchair, the weight of his defeat and his survival settling over him like a shroud. The silence of the basement was absolute, a fragile shield against the world above that was currently tearing itself apart to find him. The steam from the bowl of warm water rose between them, a thin veil in the cramped basement sanctuary. Alicia worked in silence, her hands steady as she dabbed at the blood on Lee-seol's knuckles, which were split and raw from his desperate escape. He watched her with an intensity that made the small room feel even smaller, his dark eyes tracking every movement of the woman who had plucked him from the gutter. His white shirt was damp and unbuttoned, his expensive watch a glinting, useless relic of the power he had held just hours before. "You should have left me there," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the exposed pipes humming above. "Kang Dae doesn't leave loose ends. Anyone who helps me becomes a target." Alicia didn't flinch at the mention of the man who had usurped the Obsidian Tower. She simply moved to the gash on his temple, her touch light but firm. "I've spent my life being a ghost in your building," she replied softly. "I know how to stay hidden. But a man like you doesn't end up in a subway station because of a simple mistake." Lee-seol leaned back into the worn armchair, his gaze drifting to the single amber lamp. The fallen king looked less like a monster and more like a man burdened by an impossible weight. He hadn't been defeated by a lack of skill, he had been betrayed by his own blood because he had chosen a path his ambitious cousin, Kang Dae, found weak.
They called it a coup, he rasped, his eyes darkening with the memory of the cold-blooded betrayal. But it was a trade. Kang Dae offered me a choice, the empire or the life of the man who raised me. Alicia paused, her hand hovering near his face. Your mentor? Lee-seol nodded slowly, the rigid lines of his face tightening. He had sacrificed his wealth, his protection, and his throne to ensure his elderly mentor reached safety before the syndicate turned. He had traded his crown for a shred of honor, a concept Kang Dae found laughable. To the world, he was a lethal boss of a powerful Korean syndicate, but in the dim light of a basement flat, he was a man who had lost everything to save the only person who had ever been loyal to him. Honor is a heavy thing to carry when you're running for your life, Alicia murmured, finishing the bandage. It's the only thing I have left, he replied, his lethal instincts beginning to flicker behind his eyes once more.
The amber light of the lamp flickered as the building's ancient radiator let out a dying hiss. In the silence of the basement, the sound of the world above felt magnified, the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic patter of the subsiding rain. Alicia, the humble and overlooked cleaner from the Obsidian Tower, watched Lee-seol, who sat in the shadows of the armchair, his body coiled like a spring. He looked less like a fallen king and more like a predator waiting for the first sign of a breach. It came not as a shout, but as the low, guttural vibration of an idling engine just outside the basement window. Alicia froze, her hand gripping the edge of the laminate counter. Through the high, narrow slit of glass that looked onto the sidewalk, she saw them, 3 pairs of heavy, polished combat boots. These weren't the worn sneakers of the neighborhood residents or the sensible heels of morning commuters. These were the boots of men who walked with the weight of sanctioned violence. Lee-seol was on his feet before the first heavy footfall hit the concrete steps leading to her door. The vulnerability that had defined the syndicate head in the subway station was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged focus. He didn't have a weapon, but the way his fingers curled into the fabric of the heavy coat Alicia had given him suggested he didn't need one to be lethal. "They're here," he whispered, the words barely more than a breath of ice. A heavy fist thudded against the iron gate at the top of the stairs, the sound echoing through the small flat like a gunshot. Alicia felt the vibration in her teeth. This was the moment the basement sanctuary became a trap. She looked at the door, the only way in or out, and then at the man who had traded his empire for a fragment of honor. The wolves had found the scent. The shadow of a man fell across the high window, blocking out the dim streetlights. Then came the voice, flat, professional, and terrifyingly calm. "Alicia, right? The cleaner from the Obsidian Tower?" The handle of the door turned slowly, straining against the deadbolt. Alicia stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs as the reality of the Obsidian Tower's reach crashed into her world. Kang Dae's hitmen weren't just searching for a lost boss, they were here to erase anyone who had dared to offer him a place to hide. The metal of the deadbolt screamed as the door was kicked inward, the wood splintering like bone. Alicia stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry, but Lee-seol was already gone from the shadows. He didn't move like a wounded man anymore. He moved like a blade being unsheathed. The first enforcer, a mountain of a man in a tactical vest, hadn't even leveled his suppressed weapon before Lee-seol was in his personal space. It was a silent, terrifyingly efficient collision. Lee-seol used the man's own momentum, a hand flashing out to redirect the barrel toward the floor, while his other arm coiled around the attacker's neck. There was a sickening, muffled thud as he'd driven the man's head into the edge of the iron doorframe. The enforcer crumpled into the narrow entryway without a sound. The second man, caught in the cramped bottleneck of the stairs, hissed a curse and reached for a sidearm. Lee-seol didn't give him the breath. He grabbed the heavy yellow mop cart Alicia had left by the door and shoved it with a violent, focused burst of strength. The plastic wheels shrieked against the wet floor as the cart collided with the second hitman's knees, sending him tumbling backward onto the concrete steps. Before the man could find his footing, Lee-seol was on him. It wasn't a brawl, it was a dissection. 3 precise strikes, the throat, the solar plexus, the temple, delivered with a speed that made the air whistle. Alicia watched, frozen, as the man who had looked so fragile in the subway station became a whirlwind of lethal intent. The silent language of violence was a tongue he spoke with terrifying fluency. In the cramped, amber-lit basement, he was no longer the victim of a coup. He was the apex predator reclaiming his nature. The third man at the top of the stairs hesitated, seeing his partners neutralized in mere seconds. He began to raise his rifle, but Lee-seol snatched a heavy glass jar of cleaning chemicals from Alicia's counter and hurled it with pinpoint accuracy. The glass shattered against the man's face, a spray of stinging liquid and shards, sending him reeling back into the rainy night. Lee-seol stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his white shirt now stained with fresh blossoms of dark red that weren't his own. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hum of the radiator. He turned to Alicia, his eyes still holding that chilling, sharp-edged stillness she had seen in the lobby of the Obsidian Tower. The man she had saved was gone, replaced by the king of the underworld. "They know you're with me now," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "We have 10 minutes before the next wave. Pack what you can't live without. We're leaving." The air in the freight yard tasted of rusted iron and diesel, a stark contrast to the lemon-scented sanctuary they had left behind. They huddled in the narrow gap between 2 towering shipping containers, the metal walls groaning under the assault of the wind. Alicia leaned against the cold steel, her breath hitching in the dark. The adrenaline that had carried her through the basement fight was receding, leaving a hollow, trembling chill in its wake. Beside her, Lee-seol was a silhouette of jagged edges, his gaze fixed on the perimeter where the city's distant lights flickered like dying stars. "They won't stop," he said, his voice barely audible over the rattling of the freight cars. He didn't look at her, but the tension in his shoulders spoke of a man bracing for a storm that had only just begun. "By saving me, you've erased the line between my world and yours. Kang Dae doesn't believe in innocent bystanders. To him, you are now a piece of the board I haven't lost yet." Alicia looked down at her hands, the hands that usually held mops and sponges, now stained of the soot of an industrial graveyard. She had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible at the Obsidian Tower, but tonight she had been seen by the most dangerous men in the city. The realization was a heavy physical weight. She wasn't just a cleaner anymore, she was an accomplice to a fallen king. "I knew the risks the moment I gave you my coat," she whispered, though her voice lacked the certainty she had felt in the subway station. Lee-seol signally turned to her. The amber glow of a distant security light caught the sharp angles of his face, softening the mask of the syndicate boss just enough to reveal the man beneath. He reached out, his hand hesitating before closing around her wrist, not with the grip of a captor, but with the desperate anchor of a survivor. "We are chained together now, Alicia," he murmured, his thumb brushing against the pulse at her wrist. "The invisible girl and the dead man walking. If I fall, they will find you. If you stay, we find a way back to the tower." In that moment, the freight yard felt less like a hiding place and more like a forge. The bond was forged in blood and rain, a quiet understanding that their survival was no longer a solitary endeavor. The cleaner and the king were 2 halves of a single target, and the only way forward was up. The metal wall of the shipping container was cold against Alicia's back, but her mind was burning with the blueprints of a fortress. For years, she had been an invisible fixture of the Obsidian Tower, scrubbing the grout in service tunnels and polishing the brass in freight elevators that the executives didn't even know existed.
To Lee-seol, the tower was a throne of glass and steel. To Alicia, it was a complex network of veins and hidden arteries. "They've changed the security codes on the main elevators by now," Lee-seol said, his voice a low, tactical hum. He leaned over a piece of scrap metal, his eyes narrow as he watched her in the shadows of the freight yard. "They haven't changed the trash compactors," Alicia replied, her voice gaining a new, sharp clarity, "or the ventilation access in sub-basement 3. There's a blind spot in the camera sweep near the loading dock, 4 seconds every 2 minutes when the motorized gate cycles." She began to trace a map in the condensation on the container wall. Her finger moved with a confidence that surprised them both, pointing to the ghost routes, the laundry chutes that bypassed biometric scanners, and the service ladder behind the 50th floor server room. Lee-seol watched her, his expression shifting from desperation to a grim, calculating respect. He had spent millions on security, but he had never considered the woman who emptied the bins. She was the ghost in the machine, the variable his cousin Kang-dae had never factored into his coup. "The penthouse has a private staircase," Lee-seol noted, "but it's guarded by a retinal scanner." "It's also connected to the emergency fire suppression system," Alicia countered. "If we trigger a localized heat sensor in the 89th floor maintenance closet, the emergency override unlocks the service doors for 60 seconds to allow for evacuation. No one looks at the service doors when the alarms are going off. They look at the exits." Lee-seol stepped closer, the proximity of his presence no longer a threat, but a partnership. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the freight yard in a suffocating, expectant silence. He looked at the map she had drawn, a blueprint of his own empire, rendered in the moisture of a shipping container by a woman the world called nothing. "You've been watching them all this time," he murmured. "I've been surviving them," she corrected. The king of Obsidian took a slow, steady breath, the fire of his lethal instincts fully stoked. They weren't just running anymore, they were planning an ascent. Using Alicia's intimate knowledge of the tower's layout, they were no longer just fugitives, they were the architects of a counterstrike.
The Obsidian Tower didn't welcome them back. It loomed like a tombstone against the bruised city sky. Following Alicia's lead, they slipped through the loading dock gate during the 4-second cycle she had memorized, vanishing into the structure's concrete bowels. The air here smelled of ozone and industrial grease, a sharp departure from the filtered luxury of the floors above. They began the ascent, a vertical trek through the service levels, where the walls were unfinished and the pipes hummed with the building's bloodlife. Lee-seol followed Alicia into the cramped darkness of a primary ventilation shaft. Every metal rung of the maintenance ladder groaned under their weight, a rhythmic, heart-stopping sound that felt loud enough to alert every guard in the tower. Alicia moved with a frantic, focused grace, her hands sure of every grip. She led him through the blind spots of the internal sensors, navigating the narrow maintenance catwalks that hung precariously over the elevator shafts. Below them, the high-speed cabs moved like blurring shadows, oblivious to the ghosts climbing the spine of the machine. By the time they reached the 80th floor, Alicia's breath was a jagged rasp in the dark. Lee-seol stayed close, his presence a silent anchor when the height threatened to pull the air from her lungs. He reached out to steady her as they bypassed a biometric checkpoint by crawling through a narrow laundry conduit, his knuckles still raw and bandaged, brushing against hers. They were thousands of feet above the pavement, suspended in the tower's hidden veins, moving toward a confrontation that would either restore a kingdom or bury them both. They reached the 89th floor maintenance closet, the air thick with the heat of the server racks. Alicia's hand trembled as she located the emergency sensor she had identified. She glanced at Lee-seol, whose face was a mask of cold, lethal intent in the flickering status lights of the servers. "Once I trigger this, we have 60 seconds. Then let's not waste them," he replied, his voice a low, jagged command. She triggered the sensor. A silent alarm pulsed through the system, and with a heavy, pressurized hiss, the service doors to the penthouse level clicked open.
The invisible girl had picked the lock of the world's most secure fortress. They stepped out of the shadows and into the plush, silent corridor of the summit, the ascent complete, the final battle just a doorway away.
The penthouse was a cathedral of silence and glass, the city lights below flickering like a dying empire. Kangdae stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, already wearing the mantle of a king. He didn't hear the service door click shut. He didn't notice the shadows shifting until Lee-seol stepped into the light. The confrontation was not a loud exchange of threats, but a swift, surgical restoration of order. When Kangdae turned, his face contorted from triumph to a mask of pure, primal terror. He reached for the weapon on the mahogany desk, but Lee-seol was a blur of reclaimed vengeance. With a roar of unleashed fury, Lee-seol closed the distance, his movements possessing the lethal precision Alicia had seen in the basement, but amplified by the weight of his stolen throne. He disarmed his cousin with a sickening crack of bone and a single unrelenting strike that sent Kangdae sprawling against the glass he had tried to claim. "You thought power was something you could steal," Lee-seol rasped, his voice dropping to a chilling low vibration as he stood over the traitor. "But power is loyalty, and you have none." As the syndicate's security, realizing the true boss had returned, flooded into the room and dragged the weeping Kangdae into the shadows, a heavy stillness returned to the penthouse. Lee-seol didn't look at his reclaimed empire or the men bowing to his authority. He turned toward the doorway where Alicia stood, her gray scrubs stained and her face pale, the only person in the room who had seen him at his absolute lowest. He crossed the expansive marble floor, his gait once again that of a silent storm in a perfectly tailored world. But when he reached her, the unforgiving stone of his face finally fractured. He didn't offer a command. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the pulse at her wrist, the same anchor he had found in the freight yard. "The world will tell you that you are a cleaner," he murmured, his eyes holding a fierce, protective light. "They will say you are invisible, but you are the only one who saw me when I was nothing." He pulled her into the center of the room, into the light that washed over the apex of the city. He wasn't just reclaiming his title, he was declaring a new law. In the heart of the Obsidian Tower, where he had once ruled alone, he made it clear to every shadow and every soldier in the room that the woman who had shared her coat in the freezing rain would never be overlooked. She was no longer a ghost in his machine, she was his, and the tower was now her fortress. If you enjoyed this story of the Cleaner and the Fallen King, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss a new chapter. Alicia proved that even the most invisible person can change the fate of an empire. What would you have done if you found a fallen boss in that subway station? Drop a comment below with your thoughts and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.